She sat with her arms and knees in her chest and thought about the sea. It began to scare her. Something dark appeared out of the fog. A figure stood aboard. He was draped in a long, loose black cloak. There was a boat, long, skinny, and very old. The figure held the long oar, pushing the boat closer. A shiver went up her spine. She approached with caution as the boat beached. The black cloth waved a hand slowly, inviting her in. She resisted and then was pulled in by an invisible force. She put one foot in the boat, making it wobble, and got inside nervously. A hood fell over the face of the stranger. He turned his head slightly, briefly revealing a glimpse of his hollow jawbone and one grotesque sunken eye as the light flashed on his face. He turned his head slowly, looking fully at Trillium now. She could hardly see a shadow beneath his long hood. Then he suddenly lifted a bony hand and ripped the hood from his head, making Trillium scream. His deep black eyes were no eyes at all, and his pale skin was not skin but bone. Trillium looked nervously at the animated skeleton that now stood before her. The first thought she had was to jump out and swim as fast as she could back to Maylene, but she was afraid of what might happen if she tried to run now. She didn't know the rower's capabilities. His bony hand stretched out in front of her, and she remembered the 2 coins she had in her pack. She took them out, her hand shaking slightly, and placed them in the skeleton's hands. The bony fingers closed tightly around them, popping and cracking as they made a fist. The skeleton took them and popped them into his empty eye sockets where they fit snugly. This would have been funny to Trillium at any other given time, but it frightened her now. The skeleton had eyes that were staring at her, constantly staring at her, and huge, grinning yellow teeth, yellowed with rot and decay. A few teeth were missing, adorning him with a jack-o'-lantern smile. Trillium began to feel more nervous, expecting the possessed bones to grab her at any minute, but it only pushed the boat into the water and moved it along in slow, haunting strokes. Trillium let her nerves settle a little, but remained on edge. She looked at the sea. It was still covered in a haze of fog, and wondered how big it must look in its entirety. Being on a boat was new to her, and she thought it would have been more enjoyable without the grinning and staring monster beside her. She was seeing outside Maylene for the first time, and it just so happened to be blocked by fog. Instead, she began to think of the sandy shore and the salty smell of the ocean. The fog began to clear, and she could now see all around her. There were a couple of large cliffs on the fringes of Maylene. In some spots it came down to the sandy white shore. The skeleton pushed the boat around the island, staying in the shallow waters. Trillium enjoyed the view, despite the phantom rowing the boat. She watched the waves make their way to land. It turned out to be a beautiful sunny day, and she could hear the birds singing from the forest. It seemed like a goodbye song to her. Maylene had been her home for 16 summers. She had been 3 summers old when she had been brought to the forest island. Maylene was a wonderful and tranquil place. She knew no other environment. The dream about the wizards was not a dream at all. The fire took place just before she left Phadia. The dream began to surface memories for her. She could remember her mother more clearly, and the elves of Phadia. Now she was almost certain that her dream had been a reality, and that all those elves had really been killed along with her mother. Duran never told her anything in detail, including how her mother died. Trillium figured he didn't want to hurt her and give her nightmares. Too late for that. The forest gave her all that she could ever want, except for one thing: a dependable companion. Duran never seemed to stay a whole day with her. Trillium longed to meet someone new, someone who would not keep secrets from her. She watched the island and listened to the birds sing their farewell song. She would miss her home and all the forest beauty. She figured that by the direction she traveled through the maze that she had come out on the same side of the island as her hut. They traveled about a quarter way around the island itself. The strangers must want to take me closer to my destination, but why would they send me such a ghoulish creature? Just then the fog began to roll in again, and it got thicker and thicker, until she could no longer see the water. Trillium began to think about her mother, and a warm feeling started in her stomach, and her mother's face filled her mind. Trillium lowered her head hopelessly into her hands and stayed that way for some time. When she raised her head again, she was completely surrounded in fog. She stood up quickly, wanting to make sure that the bones were still steering the boat. She could not see an inch in front of her. There was nothing but white fog surrounding her. She thought that the boatman had vanished altogether until she came within a foot from him. The black cloth appeared, but His head mixed with the fogs. The coins seemed to float in mid-air. Startled, she jumped back, making the long, skinny boat rock wildly. "You scared me!" she shouted at the figure. There was no reaction. "You can't hear me, can you?" she asked. No reply. "What a great companion you are," she said sarcastically, and began to chuckle and laugh until she was outright fighting for breath. The boatman turned his head and stared at her. Trillium continued to laugh at him. His bony fingertips made their way to her shoulder without her being aware. She jumped when she felt him touch her. The bones dug into her shoulder on pressure points that made her helpless. She curled up, sank to the floor, and whimpered from the pain. The piece of long cloth blew from the bone figure, exposing a bare ankle. Trillium looked at the narrow leg bone and gave it a good hard kick. The figure toppled, but the bone did not break as she had expected. It stood up again and came right for her neck this time. Digging with the fleshless hands. Hold on. It stood up again and came right for her neck this time, digging with both fleshless hands. Trillium tried to pull his fingers free with her own hands, but the creature was stronger than its frail image let on. She began to feel dizzy and could hardly breathe. With her windpipe closed off, she was only able to breathe small gasps at a time. She found a long oar on the floorboard and began to move it with her foot, trying to scoot it closer to her with the tip of her toe. She kicked him full force in the pelvis, jolting him upright and forcing his hands free. She grabbed for the oar and whacked the figure as hard as she could, and made contact with the skull. The head flew completely off, making a swoosh sound as it hit the water, the coins popping out. She stood relieved and breathing heavily. "You can't stare at me anymore," she rejoiced. The boatman attacked again, throwing all of its weight that was possible at her to knock her off the boat. Trillium grabbed his collarbone. She lost her balance. They toppled off together and splashed into the mysterious sea below. Chapter 2. The Adrella Sea. As soon as the skeleton hit the water, he vanished into a black cloud, leaving Trillium wrapped in the phantom's heavy clothing. She pawed wildly at the fabrics, trying to escape the grasp of the long black veil. Water entered her mouth, and she began to swallow, her head going under and feeling too heavy to hold up any longer. The first gulp went down harshly. It was salty and made her stomach swirl. The more exhaustion overcame her, the more water went in. She felt light and dizzy and began to fade to unconsciousness. All of her senses had been numbed and stripped from her control. Her body seemed to float as time stood still. The physical stress of her journey and the wounds from the birds hurt no more. Energy seemed to fill her up, but her body was gone. The fuzzy veil over her eyes began to lift. She slowly began to see colors, black and a hint of blue. Trillium could slowly feel her body again and realized she was still underwater, wrapped inside of the black cloth. She unwrapped herself, and blue overtook her vision. Slowly she began to see clearer, her body slowly regaining touch and life. It no longer hurt her to breathe. The water seemed to flow through her. As her vision sharpened, she could see rocks, fish, sand, and seaweed underneath the surface of the water. The Adrella Sea, she thought with wonder. Her eyes gazed about the ocean floor. The fish made glittering patterns as they turned, dove, and swam together in unison. Kelp and seaweed swayed back and forth with the ocean's gentle current. She tried to move herself underwater using her arms and legs. She guided along easily and began to swim fast around in a circle, getting used to the kicking. She could not understand why she could live underwater without drowning. She felt better than she had in days. The stranger's message about finding the shell was urgent. Trillium knew she must continue her quest and save all of Havenbell, even though she knew almost nothing about the Adrella Sea or its inhabitants. She was brave and courageous. That's what Duran had tried to teach her. She knew not of the life of the islands, but felt responsible for their safety. The Adrella Sea was elegant and beautiful. She swam happily about, feeling re-energized. The forest had a special link to her, but the sea, never looked or explored by her, felt stronger than the forest connection. She could hear people whispering. No, not whispering, more like thinking. Trillium hid behind a huge rock formation and peeked out of a hole at the beings approaching. Their murmurs became words. "The king has been most sorrowful lately," the first voice said to the other. The shell of hope is missing, and Fairy Island has no protection from... The second voice faded. Trillium gasped when the sea being swam into view. She no longer heard the words, but noticed that the two did not use their mouths to communicate. It must be some kind of telepathy, Trillium decided. Durrana had explained to her that if two people had a strong enough connection between them, they could share thoughts, but that did not just surprise her as much as their appearance. The sea beings looked semi-human, but had great shimmering skin like a dolphin, and long silver hair. One thing that stood out the most was their eyes. Each had large crystal blue eyes, much bigger than any eyes she had ever seen. This fascinated Trillium. She had only seen 4 sets of eyes since she left Phaedia. Her own, her mother's, Duran's, and the 2 coin eyes of the phantom boatman. None were as bright as the sea dwellers. Each had small gills on both sides of the neck and swam gracefully. When they were out of sight, she came out from behind the rock. I have no experience, no maps to find the forbidden part of the sea, she thought, and began to feel very frustrated. Maybe I can help, a small voice suggested. A young sea dweller boy with light blue eyes looked up at her. He had come when she was distracted. Who are you? She tried to center her thoughts to him, but made no sense at all. Think to me, the boy informed, trying to help out as much as he could. Who are you? She asked again, concentrating hard. She saw his face wrinkle in confusion. You're not doing it right. Try to center your thoughts and then send them to me like a white beam. She tried it and asked for the 3rd time. Who are you? That's it, he said. I'm Zeed, son of King William. I am Prince of the Adrella Sea. She tried to send the beam out again. How old are you? She asked. I'm 5 summers, but still growing. Who are you? I've never seen you before. My name is Trillium. I'm new here, she said slowly and nervously. This was the king's son, after all. I guessed that when I taught you how to talk, but it doesn't make sense to me. How can you just appear here? I'm an elf from land. No, you're not. You're an Adrella like me. What? Trillium was really confused now. I am not. I'm an elf. Just look at yourself, Zeed answered. Trillium examined herself. Her clothing was gone, but she looked different. Her skin was thick, smooth, and gray. All of her wounds were completely healed, and her hair had changed from auburn to silver, and her eyes from green to blue. You do have big ears, though. What's happening? She began to panic, her life becoming more of a mystery than ever. She realized that her pack had disappeared along with her clothing, the new arrows, her medicine, and everything else. With this last realization, she became frustrated. Come with me. So Trillium followed the boy slowly to Coral Kingdom. She could see 3 coral towers. The entrance to Coral Kingdom was getting closer and closer. She was not sure that going to the king was such a good idea, for she was still in shock about her transformation. As she swam, she watched the other Adrella swim about. She was a stranger, but luckily an unnoticed one. They entered the coral towers and went to the kingdom. Zeed took her through large round corridors and into a very large opening. The coral around began to form a cave. The top was open, letting the light come through. There were 2 guards above, for the sea was no longer safe from dark spirits. Trillium was learning how to use her finned feet. The Adrella did not have a connected tail like mermaids of old tales did. Theirs split down the center. They had legs and knees, but flipper feet. They swam together into the center of the room, where there was a large coral chair chiseled into a mighty throne fit for a king. 2 guards stood on each side. Upon the throne sat an older male, and obviously the biggest in the sea. His hair was very long and flowed behind him like a long silver scarf. Zeed swam up to him and pressed his forehead to his. Trillium watched with interest. She knew nothing of tradition here, but scouted her mind trying to remember what Duran had said about greeting kings. She came to the foot of the throne, bowing her head before him. The king turned to his son. Who is this strange girl? This is Trillium. I just met her. She claims she's from land. She thinks she's an elf, Zeed informed. You are the child of Harmony, the firstborn of 2 races. The king's face darkened, and he spoke to her mind with urgency. He motioned towards the guards who promptly left the huge throne room. You must be careful to whom you tell this to, although you are expected among the citizens of Havenbell. There are others that may harm you with this knowledge. Your life is in danger. From the wizards? She asked. You've seen them? No, but I've seen the crows. I killed them all. Are they somehow connected to the wizards? She was relieved to finally have someone to answer her questions. They are the wizards' eyes. They see for them. The wizards are after me, Trillium confirmed. Many summers ago, Havenville was still connected into one land. All types of life flourished there. The land was a place of harmony. Humans used to roam the land with the fairies, unicorns, and great winged horses. Animals of all kinds lived about the green landscape and golden meadows. Everyone lived in peace. From the gifts nature provided, medicine was found by the fairies and humans. Trillium swam closer to him, her eyes locked on his, giving him her full attention. She didn't want to miss a word. This tale fascinated her. He continued. The members of the council each had a special gift. The council's spells brought about much goodness. The magic was known as the White Fire. The legend says that 2 of the good wizards became greedy with their power and retreated to the mountains to start a new council for themselves. The temple was relocated to protect it against the Dark Ones. The new wizards reproduced, making a larger group of misfits. They began to lure innocent people into their lair. Their magic is known as the Dark Fire. They stayed hidden in the mountains for some time and then became more jealous of the temple's power because they themselves used the fairies for their own magic. They cast a powerful spell that split the ground apart and separated life onto different islands. The winged horses were killed off, all but one. The fairies survived, but the humans transformed into elves, Adrella, and feathers, which is what we call the winged people. They live in the clouds. They are also known as Josepharians. I've seen one in my dreams. The split was many summers ago, and our council is trying to find a spell to unite all of us once again. None of us can stay out of our element for long or we will die. The dark wizards want us to stay separated. Their spell also made any crossbreeding impossible. You are the first, but I must warn you, you are in very serious danger. Trillium began to understand her dilemma in its wholeness. She felt bitter towards Duran for never telling her about Havenville's history or the wizards. He never told her or warned her that she was the first half-breed. William looked down at the girl and felt relief. He was overjoyed to see that she'd made it this far without much knowledge. The creatures of Havenville had been waiting for her for a very long time, and he himself had been waiting even longer. What about the show? The girl asked. How will I know what it looks like? I've never seen one before. King William swam off his throne and took Trillium to the sandy floor where he drew the shape of the shell. The shell of hope is lost in the forbidden sea. No one ventures there. Sharks of great size live there, and they love the way Adrella tastes. The king felt grief about this mission. He secretly wanted her to stay with him. He stared at the amulet which floated around her neck. His heart felt light. It had been many summers since he'd seen the green amulet. It brought memories back and confirmed her importance. I must go, even if the sharks you talk about are killers. What do they look like? They are monstrous gray beasts. One large fin sits at the top of their bodies, and their jaws are laden with teeth that stab and rip. It will be very dangerous. The king wanted her to change her mind, but knew she would follow her destiny. I'm ready to challenge the odds. I must save us. What makes this shell so important? Spells were put into objects by the council to protect us. The crows took the shell of hope from the fairies, leaving them vulnerable to the wizard's fire. The shield was meant to keep out beings, not birds. If it is not returned, the wizards will destroy the fairies and corrupt the magic of the council once and for all. He watched for her response. I lost my medicine when I fell into the sea. I will have to be extra cautious. This worried William, but he had faith in her to succeed. Havenville's fate lies within my hands. I was raised to fight these wizards, and that is what I must do. You are very brave, Trillium, and all of us shall benefit from your generosity. Thank you. She knelt again for the king. He roared with laughter, and Zede followed with his giggles. Trillium wrinkled her brow, a little hurt. Come to me, William replied. She did, and he pressed his forehead to hers. She felt at peace in the stranger's arms. Maybe it was because of his information or because her mother was the last person to be near her. Either way, she liked King William and his son Zede. It was a nice improvement from the boat skeleton rower with a bad attitude, and he didn't even talk. She was comforted by his touch, making Trillium more calm and confident about her new journey ahead. I don't want you to go out there, but I know you must, the king said with despair. Thank you, you've been very kind to me. She gave him a swift kiss on the cheek, and a big grin stretched across his face. I must be going, Zeed. Thank you for your help. Just remember, William's voice echoed deeply, never let anyone know that you do not trust fully in heart ever find out who you are. It would make your journey very difficult. I promise, she reassured him. Follow the deep waters northeast. He pointed a webbed finger to guide her. You'll find a stone trail. Look for the small shipwreck on the ocean's floor, and you will be in the Forbidden Sea. The water temperature will drop to almost freezing, and without your medicine, I recommend you be urgent while you're searching the waters. I will miss you, Trillium thought softly to the king. We will miss you as well. Make sure to visit us when your tasks are no longer heavy. She turned her head one last time at them. King William's eyes were large and round. She felt the cold current in the water and began to follow it northeast. Her skin, soft, thick, and smooth, made her body cut right through the water. Swimming was fun to her, and she intended to get her fill of it. She dove, twirled, and spun through the water, when no one was looking, of course. Outside of Coral Kingdom, there was a lot more Adrella about. Trillium admired the uniqueness of the Adrella's features. A few Adrella turned their heads towards her, but no one took notice of the stranger. When it was clear again, she swam slower, enjoying her new body. Her belly ached for food. It had been a long time since the last bite she had taken. The Adrella Sea was calm and peaceful underneath. The Adrella lived in coral domes all over the ocean's floor. It provided a nice place to rest where they were safe from the predators of the ocean. Trillium passed quite a few Adrella holes, but ran into no one. The sea was full of life, and many colorful fish swam together in schools. They began to look appetizing and delicious. Trillium reached her arms out to shovel the fish into her mouth. They would come close, then at the last minute swim away. She began to get discouraged and began to swat at them with her hands, trying to grab one. There was a stinging at her fingertips, and when she raised her hands to her face, she noticed the webbing between her fingers. Her fingernails began to grow longer and longer until she was adorned with 2 sharp pairs of claws. Trillium was surprised by yet another transformation. It didn't really matter much to her now. She began ravaging the fish by hurting them and then sticking them with her claws. Her animal instincts took over, and she began feeding wildly. The first fish tasted divine, and each bite she took seemed to taste even better. After a few fish, she was full and happy. She swam merrily towards the Forbidden Sea, searching for the stone path at the bottom. Huge patches of seaweed grew tall on the ocean's floor. The seaweed reached towards the surface, blowing back and forth with the gentle current. Trillium swam 5 feet above the ocean's floor, scouring the bottom for the stone path. The sunset rays through the water that flickered and glittered. Kelp stretched from the bottom of the ocean to the top, an underwater jungle. A huge fish came into view. It had great skin and a long lashing tail, itty-bitty black eyes, and a large fin on the top. Trillium panicked and hid behind some coral. The shark saw her movement and followed her with curiosity. It stuck its nose into a space in the coral where she hid. Trillium looked up, her eyes wide and heart pumping wildly. The monster opened its mouth to reveal 4 rows of long, sharp razor teeth. Trillium swam out of the coral and followed the cold current at full speed. Her silver hair flowed behind her like ribbons, and the shark tagged along closely. Trillium swam as fast as she could. She noticed the stone trail at the bottom of the sea. She followed it, looking behind her at the shark. She felt a nibble at her finned foot and pulled away before the shark could bite down. Suddenly, the sunken ship came into view. A long mast stuck out sideways from the front that was buried in the sand. Coral and barnacles grew all over the surface. Trillium swam to it with the shark following her like a shadow. The shark opened its gigantic mouth full of vicious teeth, and at the last minute she squeezed into a small opening on the rusted ship. The shark examined the ship, sticking its nose into every opening, trying to sniff her out. She remained still, and after a while the shark gave up and went to search for another snack. She wanted to find the shell right away. Sharks looked too dangerous for her. She swam out of the decaying ship's opening and peered outside nervously. When she saw no shark, she ripped away from the sunken ship and back onto the path again. The cold current became almost icy. She knew she was getting closer. It appeared like land was close, but she felt very creepy about approaching the shallow waters. The temperature grew so cold that she could almost feel her blood freezing. After an hour of searching while moving northeast, her amulet began to glow a very deep green. Getting closer to the sandy floor, she searched hard but could see nothing but sand. The amulet continued to glow. Trillium stuck her webbed fingers in the sand and began to scout for the shell. She used her claws like rakes. Nothing. If I don't find it, many people may die. I can't. There was a lump in the sand. She rejoiced. The shark appeared out of the dark water. From the look of it, he had not found dinner yet. Trillium clutched the shell as tight as she could and swam swiftly away, but the shark remained close behind her, all the time moving further away from the safety of the king. She swam blind into the most dangerous part of the ocean. The shark's massive body closed in on her, nibbled on her fin, and bit down hard. She let out a cry. She turned and saw a glimpse of her chewed-up fin. The blood from the wound spread through the water like red scarves. This made the shark considerably mad with hunger. Trillium swam on, but the shark stayed close behind her. Her heart pounded and her body ached. The shark played with her like a cat would play with a live mouse. It rammed her hard from behind. The numbing impact slowed her down enough for the shark to take another bite out of her fin. She reeled again and pushed herself to swim faster. She imagined being eaten and digested by the shark. It only made her more desperate to escape. The shark closed in on her again, and she could see the sand rising. She was close to land and close to unconsciousness. She swam close to the surface. The shark swayed its large gray body behind her. Trillium turned and struck the beast with her long claws, tearing 10 long scratches into its thick flesh. The shark opened its huge mouth laden with teeth in a rage and shot forward, ramming Trillium again and almost knocking her completely out. When her senses came back, she swam to the shore like lightning. The shark didn't bother to follow her into the shallow. Trillium gasped as she surfaced, her gills starting to close and her lungs opened again. It hurt. That's all she knew when she pulled herself onto the bank. She could hear the pounding and rushing sound, what sounded like water flowing. Her body was battered and bleeding. Her mind was a mess of confusion and relief. She passed out cold on the not-so-comfortable points of the rocks and began to transform again. Phariseth flew away from Josephera, his father's kingdom in the sky. He replayed the last word his fathers had spoken in his mind like a bad dream. His father was very strong and noble, never showing defeat, sorrow, or vulnerability. Today was different. His father's main concern lately was to build a new council. Wizards were tracking the current one, and they were more secluded now than ever. What bothered him was in the tone which his father spoke today. He sounded weak and scared. Phariseth didn't like this one bit. When his father sounded scared, you knew something was wrong, and it terrified Phariseth to the bone. Our temple and our council will be doomed if the wizards find us, and I sense they are very close. The half-breed girl must come soon if she exists and is still alive. His father said sternly, but with lightness in his eyes, that Phariseth knew as love. There was something else in his eyes, something that worried him, a look of doubt. The wizards could attack any day now. King Jonathan looked at his son, and then turned his eyes to the floor. Time is short. The doubt that he saw in his father's eyes troubled him fiercely. It seemed to dig at his brain. He flew through the clouds, his large white wings gliding through the air like a large eagle. He began to see the small island from above and its mighty waterfall. As he got closer, he could see someone lying on the rocky beach. No one knows this place, Phariseth thought to himself, making him feel timid about landing and encountering the stranger. As he got closer, he could see the being more clearly. He could see blood on the rocks. He prepared to land and slowly flapped his wings and landed with grace. He approached the being slowly and cautiously, finding out it wasn't a man but a woman. There was a necklace around her neck that glimmered in the sun. It was a royal amulet. She was naked and lying on her back. There was a big purplish black bruise the size of a plate wrapped around her upper thigh. She had cuts on her face and one above her eyebrow. Phariseth's heart sank. He was looking down at the most beautiful and most beat-up girl he had ever seen. He felt guilty for looking at her bare body when she was totally unaware of him doing so. He observed her long curly auburn hair, still wet from the sea. He stared at the large bruise on her thigh, and as his eyes followed her legs down to her feet, Phariseth let out a gasp. On her left foot there was a large chunk of flesh gone just below her smallest toe. The rocks below her feet were deep red. The blood moved down the rocks like a small stream. She had a very shiny object next to her. He thought it looked like a shell from the sea, but not right somehow. He picked it up and his whole body was numbed. The object pushed a rush of power through him. His hands clasped tighter around it. He stood there for a couple minutes. His head felt light and fluttery. He then walked into a small path that led behind the waterfall. There were holes inside the rocks where he now tried to hide the shell. He almost had to pry it off of his hands. He finally let it go, which was not easy at all, and then returned to the beaten stranger. Poor girl, what could have happened to her? Fairstuff wondered. He looked at her hair, tried not to look at her body, and saw 2 long pointed ears that he had not seen before. She's an elf. How did an elf get on this island? He remembered that her hair was wet. That's impossible, he said immediately, rejecting the idea. There's no land anywhere close around here. There's no way an elf can swim that far and not drown. He saw the necklace again, and a strange thought hit him like a brick. He began to lean to touch the amulet and then hesitated. What if she wakes up? She might think I was stealing her gem or doing something to her. He stood up again. This bothered him at first, but he let it go for the time being. I can't just leave her like this. He wore a light, loose fabric, a warm cream color. His loose pants had legs that spread out near the feet, almost looking like a skirt. On top he wore a toga-like shirt that was also light in weight that hung to his mid-thigh. It fastened over his left shoulder, and a golden emblem in the shape of a circle was sewn into the fabric. There was a design of a J inside the small golden plate. His right shoulder was bare. He swiftly lifted the top over his head and draped it into his left arm. He approached the battered elven girl, leaned down and slowly lifted her. She had one arm under her back and one under her knees. He went on the right side of the waterfall to a small flat clearing. There were 2 fir trees poking up nobly from the soil. The ground was flat. A little grass grew in small patches, and dead leaves and pine needles sat scattered on the ground. Great, said Fairstuff. It's got to be better than the sharp rocks. He laid her down slow and soft, keeping her torso raised. He slid behind her on his knees and began to slip the cream-colored toga over her head. It wasn't as hard to dress her as he thought it would be. The toga hung past her knees and looked like a dress that a winged woman would wear inside the kingdom. Who is she? He wondered. He hoped from the bottom of his heart that she would be all right. Then a thought returned to him like a dream that's memory has been jogged and remembered. The necklace. His father wore one similar to it, except his stone was clear. I see it every day. How could I have forgotten? Then it was clear to him. His father's voice filled his head. The half-breed girl must come soon if she exists and is still alive. Time is short. It's her. It's the half-breed, he thought to himself. She is beautiful. His father had pressured Fairstuff to find a wife. He looked at all the women in Josepheric Kingdom, but none seemed to strike a chord within his heart. It was the child of harmony who made his heart leap. Boy, my father would kill me if I brought her home to marry. The thought of them coming together was far from reality, but Fairstuff let it live in his mind just the same. He was a dreamer, and his head seemed to be floating in the clouds most of the time. She must be an elf and a Drella. She must have swam here. It's the only thing that makes sense, and it would explain her being nude, because a Drella wore no clothing other than the armor of the warriors. Fairstuff stared at her with amazed eyes. He couldn't figure out what to do next. Should he tell his father? He looked at her again and felt sorrow for her. She was pale, and her lips were absent of all color. He leaned down and put the back of his hand lightly on her cheek. She was as cold as ice. Fairstuff felt helpless and wished he knew what to do. He looked at her badly wounded foot. He realized now that it looked like a bite from something with dangerous teeth. He looked at her pale face and lips and put his head next to hers in sorrow. In northern Havenbell, there stood 3 large mountains that were known as the Mountains of Shadow, also called the Fire Mountains. They sheltered the home of the Dark Ones. There was a large cave in between the 2nd and 3rd mountain that had served as their hideout for many winters. Screams and chants echoed through the caverns. Inside, the Dark Ones danced about drunkenly singing their victory songs. 6 of them danced jerkily around the fire pit, stumbling every few steps. They held mugs of potion, the kind to get you beyond drunk. The mugs waved sloppily side to side, the brew splashing and spilling over onto the floor. They sang together in unison. The women wizards looked and sounded more like hags or banshees, their high-pitched squeals standing out from the rest. They sang very out of tune, so bad in fact that any other creature would go insane listening to them. They all out with laughter. The women's cackles mixed with the men's bellows. The two eldest wizards, Jade and Tolan, sat down together, still laughing with horrible sounds that echoed through the cave. "Mutt!" Jade, the oldest and most wicked female, shouted. Mutt, the youngest and smallest of them, hobbled over. He was their servant, scapegoat, and victim of constant beatings. "Fetch me some more brew or I'll break your arms," Jade demanded. Mutt did a 180-degree spin and fell under his clumsy feet. This made the wizards laugh with delight. De Groot, about 20 winters old, spat on Mutt, which increased the insane laughter inside the cave. The eldest wizards were the first generation of the Dark Ones and also the leaders of this motley crew. There were 8 of them total, not including Mutt. Tolan, when standing, reached about 6.5 feet. His face laden with wrinkles, the most adorning his forehead. He looked like he was around 55 winters, but he was really 132. His nose skinny and long, and his eyes so dark that they looked black. Mutt slowly got to his feet and scuffled into a small room where the food and drink were stored. He held Jade's mug and filled it from the brew barrel. He only filled it 3/4 of the way to the top, knowing that if they spilled it, he would be beaten. Mutt took a brief glance over his shoulder to assure no one could see him. Then he hawked up a ball of phlegm and spit it into Jade's mug. He, too, had tricks of his own. "Drink this," he muttered, and went back to the fire with the others. Jade sat next to Tolan. Their 2 daughters, Aurora and Nemi, sat on the right. De Groot, Nemi's squeeze, walked around the fire continuously. "That damn kid has never been able to sit down," Jade thought spitefully. She remembered his father and mother. They called his father the Cloak, because he was the master of disguise and the master of lies. De Groot gracefully inherited his father's gifts, all except for one. Jade never liked his parents, and thought he hadn't been much of an improvement. De Groot rambled and stumbled around the fire, shouting about the crows. Ever since that half-breed girl killed 6 of his crows, De Groot couldn't stop bitching about it. "I can trick her and wring her little neck until her eyes pop out," he shouted. Jade saw Mutt hobbling in from the grub room with her fresh cup of wizard's brew. It was made from all of them except Mutt, of course, because the idiot had no power. Each put a spice of their own into the brew, but what made it really great were the fairies. The power that they contain works triple-fold when the fairies are dead. Their goodness turned bad was of high potency and is the power source for the dark fire. If you drank too much, you could kill yourself. De Groot was the master of the brew, as he was with disguise, and he never died of it like Jade had wished on many occasions. Mutt kept his face on the cave's dirty floor as he approached her. Looking at them sometimes earned him a smack or two. Mutt's heartbeat quickened with sick delight as he handed the mug to Jade. Already too drunk to notice that something was floating in her drink, she held it up to her lips without a glance at it, and took 3 big sloppy gulps. The brew dribbled down the corners of her mouth and underneath her chin. "That's what you get," Mutt thought to himself. "You mess with me, I mess with you." He was an elf before he began to feel the black need and ran away to join the wizards. He was an outcast even with the elves and could no longer be the center of jokes and victim of laughs and sneers. He began to have dreams about the dark place, the cave, and the fire. One day he met a feather by the name of Tambit, who had fled Josephera Kingdom. He had had the same dark dreams that tormented Jack. That had been Mutt's real name before the elves made Mutt his official nickname. Tambit had felt the same hatred for his race as Mutt had. They left together to find the dark cave. Tambit flew and carried Mutt most of the way. Usually this would kill both of them, being they were both restricted to their element, but they were an exception because something was protecting them. The dark wizards had given them power. 5 winters later, things had only gotten worse. All of the wizards hated him, especially Jade and De Groot. They forced Mutt to drink the dark brew but gave him no power. He was slimmer before he came to the wizards, but when he drank the brew, he got ugly just like them. He had no way to escape. He would die defenseless. Tambit had a crush on Jade and Tolan's oldest daughter, Aurora, and also became very different. Very evil, in fact. His white wings had peeled off like a butterfly's cocoon, feathers and all. Underneath he grew different wings, onyx in color and smooth as snake skin, and full of black feathers. Sharp horns adorned the points of his black wings. They gave Mutt the chills. Aurora was the best looking out of all of them, except for Lar, and they were the only two gifted enough not to develop the spots that the rest of them had. Mutt stared blindly at Jade's face without being aware of it. He looked at her black snake-like hair and her bluish-black rings under her eyes. Her eyes themselves were as black as the night sky, with an eerie emptiness like no soul possessed them. A blinding force struck the side of Mutt's head, feeling like a boulder struck his cheek. His eyes went red and his vision returned slowly. "Sorry," Mutt trembled. He realized he had been looking at her. His eyes locked on the floor of the cave. He was scared. All of the others laughed. He ran as fast as his sore legs could muster into a different passage. It was a separate cabin room that he hid when he was attacked by her. He could hear her running behind him. "I'm gonna get you, Mutt!" Duran flew fast. He was nervous about Trillium. He hadn't seen her for a while and was not sure if she had surfaced above the Forbidden Sea. She was looking for the shell. He found her pack, quiver, and bow on the island of Maylene. He held them tight in his claws and flapped frantically with his wings. He began to see the small island from above as he got closer. He could see a shape behind the trees. He could see wings, and happiness filled his head. Duran was beyond thirsty and hoped she was all right. The sight of the waterfall cheered him up a little. Farisef could see Duran coming and squinted his eyes to make out the objects that dangled from his claws. Farisef stood, then approached the shore and waved his arms frantically at the approaching owl. "Duran!" he yelled. "Hurry, there's trouble!" Duran landed quickly and without grace. He dropped the pack and quiver, spraying the arrows across the rocks. He tumbled over a couple times and then stood dizzy for a moment. "You okay?" Farisef asked, concerned, and patted the owl's white feathered head. "That was rough," he twittered. His yellow eyes rolled like a cartoon. "I should have landed in the tree." "You'll be just fine," Farisef confirmed, happy that his owl friend had not joined the girl's state of unconsciousness. He held his arm out to Duran, who swiftly hopped up. He was careful with his claws, making sure not to hurt Farisef. The prince stood up with Duran perched on his arm. He looked almost like a statue, his face a stone frown. "It's her, Duran." Farisef went to where Trillium lay sprawled on the grass underneath the tree. Duran was shocked. It was Trillium, but she was asleep and almost looked dead. There were cuts and small bruises on her face and arms. Then he saw the bloody cloth wrapped around her foot. Until then, Duran had not noticed that Farisef had no shirt on, and his flowing skirt-like pants were torn to dress Trillium. He had been too scared to notice. "What happened to her?" the owl chattered weakly. "The gray beast in the sea attacked her. Why was she in the Forbidden Sea, Duran? Everyone knows the sharks will kill you if you fall into this part of the ocean." "The wizards haven't found her yet. That's a miracle," Duran thought. He looked back at Trillium, who lay limply on her back. Her face was void of all color, and her lips were gray. "She looks dead," Duran stuttered with fright. Farisef knelt down next to her and put his hand next to her nose and mouth. "She is still alive, but she's getting worse. Time is short." He was unaware that he had spoken his father's same words and with the same frail voice. Duran flew up abruptly and soared to the shore, where he dropped the quiver, bow, and the self-made pack. He picked one of them up and came back to Farisef and dropped it in his lap. It was her pack. "Inside," Duran said hurriedly, and perched himself on a branch above Trillium. Farisef opened the pack and retrieved the strange bottle with glowing pink liquid inside. "I know that word, and I'm happy to see it," Farisef rejoiced, and uncorked the medicine. He lifted her up, letting her back lean against his chest, opened her mouth, and slowly let the pink liquid drip inside. The minute it touched her tongue, the color in her face returned. Her lips turned a healthy pink again. He slowly gave her half of the bottle and then recorked it. Duran and Farisef looked at each other and then back at Trillium. Nothing. Trillium laid her back down. "You never answered my question, Duran. Why was she in the sea?" "Did she have anything with her?" the owl asked. Oh, yes, he knew that strange object all right. He went to where he had stashed the glittery disc. When he touched it, he felt the warm, intoxicating feeling again, and when he brought it over to Duran, he didn't want to let go. He made himself drop it, and when he did, the feeling was instantly gone. "Be careful with that!" Duran warned fiercely. "It belongs to the fairies. You can't handle it." "What is it?" "The shell of hope," Duran answered. Farisef stood breathless. He had heard about the shell from his father. The shell glittered in the sun, tempting Farisef to touch it again, but he would not. Trillium's eyelids began moving and Farisef jumped over to her. They opened slightly and closed again. She slowly opened her eyes again and kept them open for a minute, staring blankly up at Farisef. She seemed to see him but looked through him at the same time. Then her eyelids closed again over the most startling green eyes he had ever seen before. Farisef sighed. I really thought she was going to wake up this time, he said glumly, and then panic struck him like lightning. My father's going to kill me. I'm late for lecture. Crap! Duran, could you stay here with her? Farisef begged desperately. Duran nodded his head and gave Farisef a wink. I have to tell my father. He's been waiting for her. Then Duran surprised him with his consent. King Jonathan must know. Now go, Duran urged him. Duran, what is her name? Trillium, he answered. Like the flower? Yes. Farisef started to leave, walking towards the rocky shore, and then stopped short in his tracks. He turned towards Duran and Trillium. You know my father? Farisef asked, bewildered. I know all of the council, Duran cooed back. This struck Farisef as very peculiar, but he had no time left to wonder. He turned towards the shore and stretched his massive wings. He flew away towards Josephera, knowing that his owl friend would protect her. It was his sworn duty.